You know me by now. When I start going,
That's right.
for some reason, I'm like a preacher. When I start going, I just start preaching. Okay, any questions or comments before we look at some things today? Did you guys get your tests back?
Yes.
Great. Okay, very good. Just making sure that any comments or questions on those. Obviously, if you've got comments or questions on on a particular answer or something that you need to talk to me about, if you want to go step into my office or call me or email me, I'm open to that anytime. Realistically, though, everybody did pretty well, so I'm not too concerned with that. Somebody tell me how you think professors are able to convince young people to buy into the whole evolution thing.
I think one of the ways is by trying to sell the fact that the Earth is old, and they, maybe looking at the Grand Canyon and showing how that's evidence of how the Earth has been here forever, or for a very, very long time, billions and billions of years.
Okay, you said the Grand Canyon. That's awesome. We're going to use that. That's kind of one of our chief cornerstones today. What else?
Well, I think more than even going to any evidence, they try to play off of really our pride.
There you go.
If you want to sound smart, if you want to be smart, then you'll believe this.
Right.
Absolutely. What we call that is intellectual intimidation. And it is probably one of the most effective tools against young people that I've seen in a long time. It is the idea that if you want to be intellectually elite, if you want to be a scholar, then you've got to buy into this because all scholars buy into it, or all of the intellectually elite people believe this. Ironically, that myth has even kind of snowballed in the academic community, meaning there were a lot of professors who didn't buy into this whole old Earth evolution concept, but because they felt like their colleagues did, they bought into it. And so it's kind of this snowballing effect of, you've got all of these individuals who are touting the same thing. Well, all smart people believe it, when in reality, none of them are stopping to ask the question, do intelligent people really buy into this thing? Here's a quote from our favorite friend, who I would challenge any of you guys to convert before you die. Richard Dawkins says, creation as literally depicted in Genesis is indeed supported by faith and needs to be, since it is not supported by anything else. Certainly not the Pope, nor the Roman, or the Anglican hierarchies. Evolution, on the other hand, he says, is supported by evidence. In fact, it was our dear friend Dawkins that said, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. So you've got a guy here who is very popular. He's got a large following in the college culture. College age groups, they are basically his prime target. He's got a massive following on the web. He comes out, he says, look, anybody that doesn't believe this, you're stupid. And yet you think about how many of our young people, our kids, our grandkids, are buying into this idea. What I want to do for just a few moments as we begin this particular part of the lesson is I want to teach you and instill in you the fact that, first off, Richard Dawkins, what he's saying here is complete and utter garbage. But secondly, more importantly, good science can start with a firm belief in God. In fact, I'm going to show you several scientists who had a great belief in God, who were devout with their belief in a God. Obviously, I'm not one of these that would go so far as to say they were New Testament Christians, because I don't think many, if any, were. But these are still God-fearing, Bible-believing individuals who were able to practice good science. So, let's get started with the first guy, Sir Isaac Newton. probably, and I say probably because obviously there's always going to be controversy, but probably the greatest scientist to ever live. This is the guy who helped develop the fields of physics, calculus, mathematics. He did a lot of work in astronomy with light, color, gravity, studied the tides, and yet, ironically, he wrote strong papers refuting atheism and defending creation in the Bible. In fact, it was Sir Isaac Newton that said, "I find more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than in any profane history whatsoever." So you've got one of the greatest scientists that's ever walked this earth that had his fingers in just about every field you can imagine, who not only did he believe in God, but he actually wrote papers refuting atheism and defending creation. Next guy would be Johann Kepler. Johann Kepler is the founder of the field of astronomy. This is a guy who actually did what you're doing right now. He studied in a seminary for 2 years. So you've got the founder of the field of astronomy who studied Bible. He said his astronomy was thinking God's thoughts after him. He also went on to say, "I see how God is also gloried by my endeavors in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God." Now, guys, do not miss the point that this man founded the field of astronomy. And yet now that particular field is absolutely inundated with people who have bought into the idea of the Big Bang. So you've got Johann Kepler who says, "Hey, I see how God is gloried by my endeavors in astronomy, for the heavens declare the glory of God." And then you march forward to the year 2010, where basically we have erased the idea of God, and now we're proclaiming that astronomy is the study of stuff that's come from a Big Bang accident. The point being, and you're going to see this throughout this particular session, is Bible believers, ironically, if you look at a percentage, they do a whole lot better science, and they actually come up with more discoveries. Blaise Pascal. Pascal came up with hydrostatics, differential calculus, the theory of probability. In fact, it was Blaise Pascal who came up with this famous wager that said, how can anybody lose who chooses to be a Christian? I was doing a mock debate this past weekend at the University of Central Arkansas campus with a fellow named Lee Rickenbacker. He's a former atheist. And in that particular debate, we talked about this very wager. And later on, after he revealed to everybody that he was now a Christian, he mentioned the fact that part of what brought him there was his wife had basically challenged him because he kept getting on to her about her belief system, and she finally turned to him and said, "Hey, look, have you ever read the Bible?" And he had to admit that he hadn't. And so she just shut him down. She said, "Well, then we're done here because you're ignorant in this whole area." Well, he decided from that point on he was going to read the Bible so he could argue with his wife. So he said, obviously not knowing anything about it, I started on page 1, Genesis 1. He said he read all the way through. he jokingly said, "Yeah, I even got to the boring parts about, if you grew a boil on Wednesday, you had to scrape it off, but if it's on Thursday, you could show it to a priest," and all these different customs, as he said. He said he finally got to the New Testament, and he said somewhere in the book of John, this thought right here hit him. And it was, what if they're right and I'm wrong? And he said, I really started grasping the whole idea of eternity. He said, you're looking at this thing from the perspective of, if they're right and I've basically done nothing, then I'm going to be in a very bad place for eternity. If I'm right, nobody's losing anything. And so Pascal's wager obviously still goes on today. Robert Boyle, father of modern chemistry. So again, we've got all these founders, we've got fathers of various scientific fields. This is a guy who's considered to be one of the greatest physical scientists of his generation. Robert Boyle actually told others about God. He did mission work. He spent his own money to translate the Bible into different tongues. He worked in the field of apologetics. And in his final will, last will and testament, he funded what's called the Boyle Lectures. Now, you would assume if this is the father of the field of chemistry, that this guy's lectures every year would be held talking about chemistry, and yet the Boyle Lectures were for proving the Christian religion. Now, again, guys, don't miss the fact that this guy is considered to be the father of the field of chemistry. And yet, he put money towards Christian-type works and to prove the Christian religion. How about these two guys, Nicholas Steno and John Woodward? These were considered to be the initial gentlemen who started the field of geology. They were the fathers of the science of geology. In all of their writings and their discussion, they formally announced the fact that the reason they even got interested in that area was because they considered themselves flood geologists. They're studying the earth and what transpired as a result of the flood. We could go to Carl Linnaeus. This was the guy who came up with the naming system. He's the founder of the biological taxonomy. He said he was trying to discover the original Genesis kinds. Basically, he wanted to know how had God differentiated all of the animals. We go to Samuel B. Morse of Morse code fame. Invented the telegraph. In fact, the very first message that was sent across the telegraph was Numbers chapter 23, verse 23, what hath God wrought? Samuel B. Morse was an artist. He was the first chair, fine arts in America. And in fact, it was Morse who said, the nearer I approach the end of my pilgrimage, the clearer is the evidence of the divine origin of the Bible. William Prout, another scientist, first to identify fats and proteins, carbohydrates. It was Pratt that came up with atomic weights. He called it natural theology. So again, the guy who realizes that things are made up of proteins and fats and that you've got atomic weights, not only did he believe in a God, he thought his whole area of study was part of that system. You got Joseph Henry, who was a physicist. He invented electromagnetic motors. This guy was the first director of the Smithsonian Institute. Now, ironically, he prayed for divine guidance before every single one of his research projects. The reason I even include this guy in the list is because if any of y'all have been to the Smithsonian Institute lately, you know it is literally just a breeding ground for evolution. It's basically like evolution on steroids. And yet the very first director was a guy who definitely believed in God. Let's move forward in time just a little bit. 19th century, we've got Louis Agassiz, who studied glaciology, natural history. We've got people like George Stokes, who studied fluid mechanics. Gregory Mendel, who some of you guys probably remember studying the pea plants. He was one of the founders of genetics. You got Louis Pasteur and his germ theory for disease. In fact, it was Louis Pasteur during his lifetime that he was persecuted by the entire biological establishment for his opposition to spontaneous generation. Also his opposition to evolution. Only his persistent and sound experiments finally compelled biologists to stop treating their patients' diseases with evolutionary-based ideas. We got people like Henry Fabre, the father of entomology. We've got Lord Kelvin of the Kelvin degree system. James Clerk Maxwell. That name doesn't ring a bell to too many people, although it should. because James Clerk Maxwell was probably one of the most profound physicists that's ever walked the earth. In fact, Einstein called Maxwell's achievement the most profound, the most fruitful that physics has experienced since the time of Newton. So here you've got Albert Einstein saying that this guy is remarkable. We asked the question, what did he do? Number one, he mathematically refuted the evolutionary nebular hypothesis that is still taught today. And number two, he scientifically refuted Darwin and other evolutionary philosophers. What about modern day examples? We move a little closer to us in time and we get to guys like Sir Ambrose Fleming, a guy who was one of the pioneers in electronics. In fact, he came up with the first true electronic tube. He considered himself to be a Christian apologist, wrote at least a major book against evolution. He was the founder and first president of Evolution Protest Movement. You got people like, let's see, George Washington Carver, one of the greatest inventors of all time. You've got Wilbur and Orville Wright. You got Wernher von Braun, one of the directors of NASA. All of these guys believed in a God. Now, I would point out, by the way, you've got Richard Dawkins who says it's absolutely safe to say that if someone doesn't believe in evolution, they're ignorant, stupid, or insane. And yet, guys, Richard Dawkins could not carry the shoes of some of these men. Because when it comes to doing actual science, these guys absolutely blow him away. You know, Richard Dawkins is great at culture rioting and making money from a popular standpoint, but when it comes to actual science, he can't hold the shoes of these guys. 1861, the French Academy of Science published what it considered to be 51 scientific facts that contradicted the Bible. Today, not one of these still accepted, but the Bible still stands. Historically, it is the Bible which has taught science and not the other way around. Let me give you one more guy, and this one, if this doesn't impress you, nothing will. Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday is a physicist, was a physicist. In fact, those of you who had to take physics, you may remember Faraday's constant. Well, that's named after this guy right here. One of the greatest physical physicists of all times. He worked on electrical generators, and yet it was he who said the Bible and it alone is what is important. In fact, let me read to you something that happened several years ago. It says, a crowded gathering of distinguished scientists have been listening spellbound to the masterly expositions of Michael Faraday. For an hour, he had held his brilliant audience enthralled as he demonstrated the nature and the properties of the magnet. He had brought his lecture to a close with an experiment so novel, so bewildering, so triumphant that for some time after he resumed his seat, the house was rocked with enthusiastic applause. The Prince of Wales, afterward who would become King Edward VII, he rose to propose a motion of congratulations. That resolution having been duly seconded was carried with renewed thunders of applause. Suddenly the uproar ceased and a strange silence settled over the audience. They all wanted to know, what is he going to say? Because here you've got the future king who has just rose to propose a motion of congratulations to you. And yet, he didn't appear. Only his most intimate friends knew what had become of him, for you see, Michael Faraday was an elder in a little Sandemanian church. The hour at which the Faraday had concluded his lecture was the hour in which they had their weeknight prayer meeting. The point being, guys, he wasn't concerned with the praises of men. He was concerned with obeying God. Now, here's why I showed you guys that, and here's why I hope that you will keep some of this in mind. How many young people do you think of are sitting in congregations that could get a pretty good shot in the arm if they realized that there were a lot of smart people out there who also believed in God and did good science. Young people who bought into this lie that all intelligent people. I mean, I showed you guys what I consider the Cliff Note version of this. But guys, that is a bombshell if you teach that at a high school or college level. Because colleges don't want people to realize, hey, some of the very fields of science that we're studying were founded by men who believe in a God. Because suddenly the kids are going to realize, hey, maybe if it's good enough for them, maybe it's good enough for me too. Questions or comments? You guys going to be quiet on me today. See, I might have to bring up angels again. By the way, just for my personal pleasure, next time one of you sees Dean, would you please tell him that he missed a great discussion, that we went ahead and ironed out all of the issues about the Nephilim, the angels, and the giants in the land.
Okay.
And really make me happy and tell him that Wayne and I forgot to get it on the recorder. So, all right, what about the field of cosmology? What I want us to do for a little while is that we're going to go through and we're going to look at some proof, some evidences that the Earth is young. And I'm going to bounce around a little bit. I'm going to try to keep it as organized as I can for you. But understand that, there's a lot out there, a lot of different aspects, a lot of different fields. So here's what we do. Here's where we go. On the screen right now is a picture that is in many of the textbooks. It's kind of the general picture of what the Big Bang Theory is supposed to be. You'll notice it covers a time span from the bang to today of roughly 13.7 billion years, it says at the bottom. Most astronomers now would bump that out to about 18 to 20 billion years. What do we know as far as evidence of how long ago the Big Bang really did take place? What can we learn from other planets that would either support or disprove this whole idea? And some of this we've talked about, some of it will be new. Number one, we know Jupiter's too hot. We know, in fact, that Jupiter is still cooling off. It is receiving it's giving off twice as much heat as it receives from the sun. Now that in and of itself, scientifically speaking, is enough for us to stop and go, okay, obviously Jupiter can't be that old because it's still cooling off. If I'm giving off twice as much heat as I'm receiving from the sun, we got some problems. We also know that NASA has photographed volcanic eruptions on the moons around Jupiter. We know, for instance, that Ganymede has a strong magnetic field. Anytime you've got a magnetic field that's generated by liquid molten metal inside, and yet Ganymede should have cooled solid billions of years ago. We look at the rings of Saturn. And yet, here's what we learn. Those rings are unstable and incapable, let me back up, incapable of being billions of years old. We turn our attention to something as trivial as a magnet. A couple of things we know about magnets. Number one, we know they lose their strength over time. Number two, we know the Earth has a magnetic field around it. We also know that the Earth's magnetic field is deteriorating, and we've lost 6% in the last 150 years. Now, if that's the case, which it is, that means the Earth can't be can't be billions of years old, and also carbon dating can't work for it because that depends on uniformity. Because, guys, if this Earth really were billions of years old, there should be no magnetic field left. We also know the Sahara Desert is going through a process called desertification. We've got a prevailing wind pattern that is causing it to actually grow. And in fact, if you look at the map on the screen, you'll notice the yellow area, the past extent of the desert, the orange area is the present, the hatched area at the bottom is the direction it's moving. We do the math, we extrapolate backwards, we say, okay, how old is the Sahara Desert? According to the Institute for Climate Impact Research, it's only about 4,000 years old, which would conform nicely with the information given the fact that the flood happened roughly 4,000 years ago. All right, we turn our attention to oil. We know in places like West Texas, you got lots of oil underground. We also know that some of the wells that have been dug are holding oil underground at pressures as high as 20,000 pounds per square inch. Now, to give you guys a good, accurate comparison, if you think about your car tires are sitting outside at roughly 35 psi, this is 20,000. But there again, you've got to ask that logical question, okay, if there's oil under sedimentary rock that is trying to push its way up, how long can sedimentary rock hold pressures that much? The answer would be less than 10,000 years. We talked a little bit about where they say the oil and natural gas comes from. And you remember, hopefully, that rather than, obviously, they're saying it takes lots of organisms, heat and pressure, and they would say millions of years. You might mention that we talked a little bit about it. Probably some of this came from the flood event. Where else could some of this have come from? Coal and oil, way underground. What are some other possibilities?
I don't know.
Oh, y'all gonna make me unplug my cord now. Let's think about this for just a moment. What does it mean that God created a mature earth? Did he create a mature?
Yes.
Did he create a mature earth? Yes, absolutely. How do we know for sure he created a mature earth?
Well, because Adam was speaking, he had to have eaten fruit that was already on the trees.
Okay.
Animals walked in front of him and things like that, so.
So how big were the trees?
Full grown.
Full grown.
Okay. So everybody there is willing to admit that, yes, there was a mature earth. Is it possible that God in his wisdom created a completely mature earth, meaning there was already fossil fuels and things in the ground?
Yes.
Yes.
It's possible. Absolutely it's possible. So, while I think some may have come from the flood, I think we've got to realize the wisdom of God is far, far, far exceeds anything that we could ever come up with. And so if he realizes, hey, these are going to be people who need fossil fuels in 3,000, 4,000 years, he's smart enough to get them there for us. One thing I would point out just from a scientific perspective is, guys, don't buy into all the hogwash about us running out of fossil fuels as quickly as you might think. The latest information that I've read is, we dug the West Texas plains out pretty big about 20 to 30 years ago. And basically all the oil folks left town. The oil wells dried up, and a lot of those little towns basically went bust. And yet now, they can't drill wells fast enough there because the oil's back. And so everybody's, getting all excited and wondering, okay, where did it come from? How did it get there? And the point may be that it probably doesn't take as long as we thought it did. Okay. The slide on the screen right now is one that I like to show just because to me it shows shows two problems that we've got in our educational system. Somebody tell me, what is the educational system that kids are using today? Well, our president, bless his heart, enacted several years ago, enacted a program in our school system. Anybody remember what it's called?
No Child Left Behind.
No Child Left Behind. Somebody give me a layman's, easy to understand version of what the No Child Left Behind Act really does.
What it really does?
And guys, again, if you don't know this, number one, shame on you, because we got to get brushed up on what's going on in our society. You're talking schools in our community. Number two, we need to be helping parents to educate themselves and educate their kids about what's going on. No Child Left Behind simply says this: from this point forward, we're going to start testing kids on a regular basis to see where they are so that they don't get left behind, and we're going to judge their performance and the teacher's performance accordingly. In other words, you can throw all that out the window and simply put standardized testing. And so now, instead of only being tested maybe once or twice in their 12 years, now our kids are tested a lot more frequently to make sure they're not being left behind. Here's the problem with that, guys. When you test that often, that much for every grade, guess what the teachers find themselves doing?
Dumbing down.
They dumb down, and what do they teach for?
Teach to the test. Yep.
Teach to the test. And so kids, in all honesty, kids aren't really learning. What they're doing is they're memorizing trivia for these tests. They're not. I think one of the worst things that we've done in the American education system is we've taken out critical thinking and we've replaced it with memorizing trivia. So back to this slide that's up on the screen. This is out of a Chris Hall General Science book. A kid looks at it, and here's what he reads. He says, for example, the Mississippi River deposits sediment at a rate of 80,000 tons an hour. That kid has been so conditioned into standardized testing that he memorizes basically what I've highlighted. Mississippi River, 80,000 tons an hour. And yet he never stops to ask the critical question of, okay, if that is true, which by the way it is, if that's true, how much further should the delta stretch out into the Gulf of Mexico if that Mississippi River has been dumping 80,000 tons an hour for 4.6 billion years? You see the situation? In other words, guys, they don't stop to think to ask the question, would there even be a Gulf of Mexico? The point is, if this Earth were 4.6 billion, there would be no Gulf of Mexico at all. It would have already filled in by now. We look at things like tree ring dating. And yet we know that's not a great science. But let's ask the question. On the screen, you're seeing a 43-year-old bristlecone pine, the Earth's oldest organism. Well, that really kind of begs the question, does it not? If that's the oldest living organism and it's 4,300 years old, why, if this Earth is billions of years old, why don't we have things a lot older than that? The answer is because this Earth isn't that old. And because a flood took care of everything about 4,300 years ago. We go to the coral reefs down around Australia. You guys probably familiar with the Great Barrier Reef? Several years ago, they did experiments because they were afraid the Great Barrier Reef was dying out, that we were going to lose it. Lo and behold, it came back with information that showed that not only is it not dying out the way they thought, that we can actually build a reef a lot quicker than they thought. And they realized with their research that it's less than 4,200 years old. The evolutionists are very, very quick to tell us that fossils take millions of years to form. In fact, they would say the whole fossilization process, if you think about it, that proves that things are ancient, and they give all these wonderful ages to all these different periods. And yet, we've got fossils that can't be millions of years old. Let me show you what I mean. This is a fish that's recently eaten a fish. So the question then becomes, all right, does it take millions of years to digest? Because you got fossil evidence showing that this guy just recently ate him, and then he was quickly fossilized. If we have time later today, I probably will show you some pictures of amber. Somebody tell me what amber is.
It's a resin out of a tree.
Right. Resin out of a tree, and we know, like from Jurassic Park, they occasionally would trap insects, mosquitoes in it, but it would also trap air bubbles, which tells you what? Number one, that wasn't a really slow process, because obviously if there were air bubbles, or if it was a fast process, it would exclude the air bubbles out of it. The other thing that I'll try to point out if we look at it will be the fact that they've analyzed some of the air caught in those amber, and it's interesting that it holds a whole lot more oxygen than what we've got today. This is a picture out of, I think, National Geographic, where it's talking about Carlsbad Caverns. Tiny drops of water, they say, over millions of years silently created the most awesome monument, the wonders of the nature. Crystal Spring Dome, the Hall of Giants are names that hint at some of the magnificent formations discovered in rooms the size of Concert Hall in Carlsbad Caverns. And so, again, have the mainstream media, have textbooks been successful at training kids to think when they see stalactites, stalagmites, that means millions or billions of years? Absolutely. In fact, I can remember when I was a scout of going through a cave like this one and listening to somebody tell us not to touch the stalactites because the grease on our fingers would slow down their formation, and that, it took, I forget what they said, thousands of years for each inch to grow or whatever. And yet the reality of it is we know it doesn't take thousands of years. On the screen you see the Lincoln Memorial that was built in 1922. Here you see a picture taken in a level 5 lead mine in Australia. The one thing that I would point out, the top arrow is going to a switch sign. And there are stalactites hanging off of that switch sign. This one, hopefully, you guys realize did not happen millions of years ago. That would be indoor plumbing. This is one of my favorites. This is from Mother Shipton's Cave over in Yorkshire. A Christian friend of mine, a fellow by the name of John Galloway, sent it. It's a place where it's a cave where you can go and you can tie off, your teddy bear or hat or purse or whatever. Come back in 3 days and it will be completely covered over, just like a stalactite or stalagmite. This is a bat covered in flowstone, Carlsbad Caverns. Again, you got to ask the question, did that little bat just sit there while tiny drops of water over millions of years hit him in the back? Or is their whole timing process screwed up? Let me show you one that I think is kind of cool. This is called TP Fountain. 1903, they had found a hot mineral water that was coming up through a pipe. They stuck a bigger pipe on it. Lo and behold, that is TP Fountain today. And just to give you an idea of how big it is, the guy who's standing there is roughly 6 foot tall, and it keeps on growing every single year. They keep adding pipes up at the top of it. How about this one? Niagara Falls. Somebody says, give me some proof that things are young. You say, okay, what about the falls? They say, well, what about Niagara Falls? You say, well, according to science, what you learned in your science books, when the water goes over those falls, the whirlpool action at the bottom erodes away the underlying bedrock, causing the whole fall to basically erode back a little bit every year. In fact, let me show you a slide. This is showing the crest lines all the way back since 1764. So if you look very carefully, what you're going to see is lines that have a year after them. That is where the falls, the leading edge of the falls were at that time. Now, you'll notice it says 865 feet in 185 years, approximately 4.7 feet per year. 4.7 feet a year. Now, they have put in water diversion units to slow it down, but check out this textbook. It says a gorge about 7.5 miles long runs just below Niagara Falls. A simple calculation shows that it has been 9,900 years, or 9,900 years, since the Niagara River started cutting its gorge back. Guys, that's a whole lot closer to 6,000 than it is 4.6 billion. You know, when you do the math and you look at the falls itself, you realize this thing hadn't been here all that long. So again, just one more little piece of evidence. This is a picture of trying to show the water cycle. We know today that the oceans are 3.6% salt water. We know how the salt gets in the water. We know that it evaporates up into the clouds move over the land surface. It then rains down, it picks up salt minerals, deposits them in the ocean. The point being, guys, we could have gone from fresh water to salt water in less than 5,000 years. So, over and over and over again, we start getting this redundant view that maybe things aren't as old as they would have us believe. The problem is most people have been what I call evolutionized. For instance, our kids bring home a book just like this one, and we don't think anything about it. And yet, look at the first word, guys. What does that word mean?
It means before man.
Before man. How long was there before man?
5 days.
So, you know, I guess realistically, if you wanted a prehistoric animal guide, it would be all of them because everything was created before man. Here's what I want to show you, though, guys. You look for that word in a dictionary, 1766. You'll notice it's not there. You go all the way up to 1860, Webster's first dictionary, the year after Darwin wrote his book, Origin of Species. Guess what? It's still not there. It's only within the last 100 years or so that we have bought into this idea that, you know, man was the latecomer, that evolution is real. The point being, that's not science, that's Hollywood. That's basically a man-made bunch of garbage that they are trying to embed in the hearts and minds of our kids. Somebody tell me what that is.
Like a tool.
It's a hammer.
It is a hammer. It's a hammer that was actually found in Texas by a lady named Emma Hahn, June 1934, London, Texas. Seashells surrounding the hammer have been dated at 400 million years old. Part of the hammer had already turned to solid rock. The point being, guys, hopefully I don't have to tell you, men were not around making hammers 400 million years ago. How about this one? We're going to talk about evidence for a young earth. Let's talk about coal for just a moment. If I were to mention the word coal, a lot of times we think of things like lots of vegetation, lots of heat, lots of pressure. Evolutionists would tack on the words millions of years. And yet we know beyond the shadow of a doubt it doesn't take millions of years. J.D. Saxby, in his book on petroleum generation, he said in many geological situations, much longer time intervals are available. Basically saying, don't get me wrong, I still buy into evolution. But he goes on to say, but evidently the molecular mechanism of decomposition is little changed by additional time. Thus, within sedimentary basins, heating times of several years are sufficient for the generation of oil and gas from suitable precursors. Now, did he say several 100,000 years or million?
No.
Guys, we can do this for you in a laboratory setting nowadays in about a month. Now, it's incredibly expensive to do it because you do have to use a lot of pressure. But the point is, we can do it. So, how long ago did coal form? According to what's in your kids' textbooks, according to what the mainstream media is trying to tell you, is that all coal was laid down during the Carboniferous period. That's how it got its name, carbon, 250 million years ago. So allegedly, coal was laid down before the dinosaurs walked on the earth. Now bear that in mind. Supposedly coal is here before the dinosaurs, and then consider some things that have been found in coal. Like, for instance, Mr. Newton Anderson found this bell inside of a lump of coal in 1944. He still owns it. Ironically, if you take a look at the timeline that is in most textbooks, Mr. Anderson's bell would fall somewhere down around where you see the first critters crawling out of the water coming onto land. So apparently those first fish that decided to grow out on the land also were very good at working with metal and making bells. And yet, as we've talked about, the Bible presents a totally different picture. Genesis chapter 4, verse 22, Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. We go to the Morrisonville Times. Again, this is a newspaper report. Curious find was brought to the light of Mrs. S.W. Culp last Tuesday morning. She was breaking a lump of coal apart, embedded in a circular shape. A small gold chain, about 10 inches in length and antique and quaint workmanship, fell out. So I guess maybe the fish that crawled out of the ocean that like to manufacture bells also was wearing necklaces.
He's more evolved than the others.
Yes, very much so. This is a cast iron pot that was found in coal in 1912 at the Municipal Electric Plant in Thomas, Oklahoma. This is a 4.5-inch high zinc and silver vessel that was found in solid rock, allegedly over 600 million years old, in Dorchester, Massachusetts. This is a clay doll that was found at a well depth of 320 feet near Nampa, Idaho. Rock layer was supposedly 12 million years old. So again, you got to wonder, did the fish that came out like to play with dolls and need a little clay pot while it was wearing a gold chain all the while, chilling with all these different little nuggets and trinkets. 1865, workers found human bones and a well-tempered copper arrowhead in a vein of silver at the Rocky Point mine in Gilman, Colorado. 1880, J.D. Whitney, the state geologist of California, published a lengthy review of advanced stone tools found in California gold mines. The implements including a spear, mortar, and pestles. They were found, get this, they were found deep in mine shafts underneath thick, undisturbed layers of lava ranging from 9 to 55 million years old. How do you get tools that would only be attributed to human beings in layers that are supposedly 55 million years old? Unless, in fact, number one, those layers weren't that old, and number two, it could have had something to do with a global flood. W.H. Holmes, Smithsonian Institute, one of the most vocal critics of California finds, he said, perhaps if Professor Whitney had fully appreciated the story of human evolution as it is understood today, he would have hesitated to announce the conclusions, notwithstanding the imposing array of testimony with which he was confronted. Now, guys, think about what he's saying right here. You got a guy who basically told the truth and said, look, we found all kinds of implements. We found mortars, pedestals. We found spears from undisturbed layers of rock in these mines that we would date 9 to 55 million years old. And yet you've got an evolutionist from the Smithsonian Institute who says perhaps he should have kept quiet or should have hesitated to announce his conclusions if he really understood human evolution. Probably, though, one of the most interesting finds in coal was made by a fellow by the name of Albert Ingalls. Take a look at what he found. This is on sites reaching from Virginia, Pennsylvania, through Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, westward toward the Rocky Mountains. Prints have from time to time been found on the surface of exposed rocks, and more keep turning up as the years go by. What made these prints? As yet, the answer is unknown to science. They look like human footprints. And it's often been said, though not by scientists, that they really are human footprints made in the soft mud before it became rock. He goes on to say, if man made these prints in this manner, then man's antiquity is no matter of a million years or so, as scientists think, but 250 million years, for they're found in the rocks of the Carboniferous period, and those rocks were laid down 250 million years ago. And just to remind you guys, if you look on the screen, right here is the Carboniferous period. You don't get dinosaurs until basically the end of the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous. We're all the way up here at the top of the column. And yet you've got footprints in coal. How in the world do you explain it? Now, here's an image of what he found. Jerry, what's the first thing you think about when you look at those feet? What comes to mind when you look at those footprints on the top row? Hello.
Well, I'm trying to do. Maybe we
Let me ask you this: do your toes look like that?
No, they look manufactured.
No. Okay. So your toes aren't spread out like that, are they?
Mm-mm.
The reason why your toes are not spread out like that is because your feet are comfortably sitting in a pair of shoes right now. Hopefully.
Yes.
and have been for the last 30 or 40 years. Now, if you look at the bottom two pictures, they are pictures taken of individuals who habitually go unshod, who don't ever wear shoes. And if you look at their toes, you'll notice they are literally splaying out, that they've kind of got almost a different look to them. All right, so we asked the question, are we really sure that these things are human footprints? They asked a guy by the name of Dr. A. Wilder-Smith to examine them. Here's what he said. The tracks are in the formation considered to be upper Carboniferous. They show 5 toes, an arch which is unquestionably human. The tracks are 9.5 inches long, 4.1 inches broad at the heel. The width at the forward end of the track by the toes was 6 inches. The being that left the tracks was a biped that walked uprightly like a human. Now again, guys, just to make sure you don't miss it, these things supposedly were laid down in the Carboniferous period, long before anything was upright and walking. Okay, so even if you don't like the idea that these are human, you still got to tell me, are they mammal? What are they? So I want you to read with me how Albert Ingalls explains these. He was asked to write an explanation. You can still find it today because it was published in Scientific American. Here's his explanation. He said, if man or even his ape ancestor, or even the ape ancestor's early mammal ancestor existed as far back as the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology will be so completely wrong that all geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud of the Carboniferous period with his feet. Science rejects the attractive explanation?
Yeah.
What is he saying, guys?
You can't explain it.
Exactly. He didn't give an explanation. First off, science doesn't reject an attractive explanation. True science is just simply reporting the data.
Right.
What he's trying to do is basically blow smoke at you and hope you don't see through it. All right, what about this thing? Somebody tell me what we know about the moon as far as a young Earth perspective.
It's supposed to be the same age as the Earth, is it not?
Okay. I would say it's about 4 days younger, but that's beside the point. We also know that the moon is regressing away from the Earth. It is regressing just a few centimeters per year. But there again, guys, we can use that information and ask a logical, basic question. If the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, how much closer to the Earth should the moon have started out? And the answer is, it should have passed through the moon to the other side. Or should have passed through the Earth to the other side. That it should have started way far, 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 far away, passed through the Earth all the way to the other side. And yet I think we all realize that's ridiculous. Questions, comments so far?
Hey, Brad, I've got a question. When we're talking
Absolutely.
about the rates, like the rate of, say, what you just said, the rate of the moon digressing away,
Yep.
or regressing
Yes.
away, and we say that that rate is constant, isn't that sort of an assumption that it's always been the way it appears to be now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because we're having to do what they do, and that is basically assume that everything is uniform, that it's been the same rate the whole time. But the point here being, we are assuming on a much, much smaller time scale
Yeah.
So if you add billions of years, they've got an even bigger problem to figure out. See what I'm saying?
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's a big difference.
Okay.
That's good.
All right. Other comments, questions?
Yeah, Brad,
Yes, sir.
just curious, have evolutionary scientists, have they pinpointed a location within the universe where this Big Bang may have occurred? I mean, I don't know if you're...
The short answer of your question is no, because basically the universe is so vast, they don't know where to look that would be the center of the universe. Here's the thing. I'm not going to unplug it. I'm going to see if I can do it this the right way. Let's try this. The short and the long of it is this. If there really was a Big Bang, we would expect a central place where all the energy is coming out of, and then we would expect fairly constant distribution in all directions from that central Big Bang. And yet, when we look out into the galaxies, what we're finding are areas that have clumpy galaxies, where they're literally all over the place, and then we got places in space that are big voids, where there's nothing. And then you follow that up with another clumpy galaxy or another dispersed area. So when they look out in space, it's kind of like, okay, you got just all this stuff, but there's not what you and I would look for as far as a tapering effect that would come back to a central locale. Other comments, thoughts? Good question.
Does the various spinning of planets and such cause a problem there too? Like
Absolutely.
one going clockwise, one going counterclockwise, or
Yep. Let me see if I've got that. I tell you what, I'll pull those up after the break. But yes, you're right. It does. Any other thoughts?
I do have a question.
All right.
I'm sorry, Brad. Back to your
Sure.
back to the water on the Earth, and the 3.6% salt value to it.
Yes.
Were you saying that were you saying that the salt water was in existence after the 40 days of the rain, or during that time, or? I know you didn't say it, but would you say it?
I'm saying that if every drop of water that was on this planet was all fresh water, all the way back 4,000 to 5,000 years ago,
Right.
we could have gone from fresh water to salt water just using the water cycle and picking up minerals from the land and depositing them in the ocean. So my thought is, in our reality, when the flood actually happened, you'd had roughly 1,500 years transpire between creation and the flood. At that point, you've probably got somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 1% salt, maybe a little less than that, 0.8, something like that. It would be close to what you and I would call brackish water. And if you know anything at all about fish that can live in both, they do very well a lot of times in brackish water. It's kind of like the best of both worlds, because you've got just enough salt for the saltwater fishes to really thrive, but you can also grow some really large freshwater bass in those intercoastal areas. So you got, we'll say 0.8 to 1% salt water before the flood. Flood happens, lots of fresh water is dumping onto the earth. God causes a wind, he pulls the mountains up, you got a water table below us, you got clouds above us. So it's kind of like hitting a reset button. You've suddenly introduced loads and loads of more fresh water. So now instead of being 0.8 to 1%, now we're back to maybe 0.2%. We go from 0.2 to 3.6 where we are today in just about the perfect amount of time. All because of just one simple thing, the water cycle. And there again, guys, think about this. Number one, if the earth were billions of years old, the water should be so much more salty, it shouldn't sustain life. But think about how much sediment should be at the bottom of the ocean. If everything is millions or billions of years old, there should be so much sediment down there. The other thing, and this is, to me, this is just one of those duh, that makes sense things. We know water, rain, is eroding down the mountains. I mean, that's one of those things that it just happens. Well, if rain erodes the mountains down into the rivers and down into the oceans, doesn't it make sense if this earth were billions of years old that it should be a whole lot flatter than it is today? You know, why haven't these mountains eroded down? Why don't we see a lot more erosion marks all over the planet? Because after all, you've had billions of years to erode. And the answer is we don't see it because it ain't there. All right. Anything else? Good comments. This is this beginning part is just something for you guys to think about, maybe a little bit of a sermon starter for some of you in the future. It says, is there anyone here who thinks teachers or textbooks should be allowed to deliberately lie to students for any reason? The Wisconsin Administrative Code 361 rule for their textbooks specifically says the criteria for selection of textbooks shall be, number 3, that they shall be factually accurate. So according to their codes that they put before the school board and before themselves, in order for them to accept something to teach to kids, it's got to be factually accurate. We go to Texas, the Administrative Code, Title 19, under the Education, Section 66.66, says instructional materials shall present the most factual information accurately and objectively without editorial opinion or bias by the authors. They go on to say theory shall be clearly distinguished from facts and presented in an objective manner. So Texas is saying, look, leave your opinion at home, just give the students the facts. We go to Florida. Florida Statute 1006.35 on the accuracy of instructional materials. First point says, in addition to relying on statements of publishers or manufacturers of instructional materials, the commissioner may conduct or cause to be conducted an independent investigation to determine, notice this, the accuracy of state-adopted instructional materials. When errors in the state-adopted materials are confirmed, the publisher of the material shall provide to each district, the school board that has purchased the materials, the corrections in a format approved. So, in other words, if a textbook manufacturer has a lie and the school board finds out about it, they're going to hold the textbook publishing company subject to that lie. Number 3, commissioner may remove materials from the list of state-adopted materials if he or she finds that the content is in error and the publisher refuses to correct the error when notified by the department. So now we got California that says, okay, it's got to be true. It's got to be factual, accurate. California, of all places, the textbooks shall be, quote, factually accurate and incorporate principles of instruction reflective of current and confirmed research. Minnesota, Code of Ethics 8700.7500 for Minnesota teachers. Subpart 2, Standards of Professional Conduct, says a teacher shall not deliberately suppress or distort subject matter. Now, I give you guys all of that as kind of the background to think about where we are today versus where we used to be. You know, isn't it ironic that we've got on the books a lot of laws that basically say, look, you're supposed to be teaching the kids the truth. And yet today we're teaching more humanistic garbage, more atheistic garbage, more Islamic garbage, more evolutionary garbage, more materialistic garbage than in any generation. You go to public textbooks. This is one from 1908. Says, you'll notice highlighted, it says, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. All that was made was very good. In that same textbook, it says prayer is a duty. But it is also in vain to pray without sincere desire in the heart to obtain what we pray for. Repeat the words of prayer without such desire is a solemn mockery. So you got a public school textbook in 1908 that says it's a duty to pray. This one, it says, God governs the world in infinite wisdom. The Bible teaches us that it's our duty to worship Him. It is a solemn thing to die and appear before God. So again, public school textbook, 1908, is teaching some pretty serious concepts in relation to heaven, hell, God, etc. We then take a look at this map. This was put out in 2002, 2003. This was the Scientific American did a study to see how well evolution was being treated in the public school system. In other words, if your state is on here and it is red, then that means your state is not teaching evolution satisfactorily, or that it's absent, or that it's useless. You'll notice California, some of the eastern states are doing a very good job of teaching evolution. So back to our point. Is there anyone here who thinks teachers or textbooks should be allowed to use outdated, false information just to get their students to believe this theory? Anyone here who thinks that teachers that deliberately lie should be fired? In other words, if a teacher is purposefully deceiving somebody, should they be held accountable? Anybody here who thinks textbooks with lies should be banned or the lies torn out of the textbooks? In fact, Alabama Code 1975 says adequate textbook provides all students in the public schools shall be provided with adequate and current textbooks. One might argue the textbooks that contain statements and examples that are proven to be false or fraudulent are neither adequate or current. Having set the stage for all of that, let's look at some lies, so to speak, or some fraudulent material. This is a picture, obviously, of the Grand Canyon. Notice what the caption says in this Prentice Hall book. Over millions of years, the Colorado River has carved out the Grand Canyon from solid rock. So, textbooks today, in fact, James, was it you who mentioned the Colorado River Grand Canyon argument?
Yes, sir.
This is kind of one of their fundamental arguments for an old Earth. So let's look at what we've got. Here's the fact. The fact is the Grand Canyon exists, period. We can prove that. That's not up for debate. What is up for debate is our interpretation. You got a creationist interpretation and an evolutionist. Evolutionists say it was formed slowly by a little water over lots of time. Creationists would say it was formed quickly by lots of water over a little time. Evolutionists are always trying to erase the line of fact and make the student think that their interpretation is a part of that fact. But again, guys, remember, all of these school places, they don't want opinion. What they're wanting is fact. They're wanting to basically indoctrinate students with the truth. And yet, look at what we got. Colorado River is cut through layer upon layer of rock over millions of years. How do you get away with saying that's a fact? Here's one that's used. The University of Science an artist in Chickasaw, Oklahoma, where they say the Colorado River is cut through over 2,000 meters of rock, exposing sedimentary layers. They're like huge pages from the Book of Life. Scanned through a canyon wall, you can look back through hundreds of millions of years. This one says if a dam were to cross the Grand Canyon, a large lake would form. Trying to give the Colorado Basin idea that all of this is because of the Colorado River. So we say, okay, what do we know about it? If we look, for instance, just at the Colorado River Basin, you look on the screen, you'll notice I've highlighted an area. I'm going to show it to you from a map perspective just so you can kind of see what we're talking about right here. This is the area that's in question. So we say, okay, obviously we know it exists. We can take pictures of it. We got all kinds of beautiful scenery. The question is, how did this get there? And what is the problem with us saying that it was formed by a river? Let's start right here. You'll notice this is a satellite image. You'll notice it shows snow right through the middle. Why does it show snow right through the middle? Because that's actually at a much higher elevation. That area is 6,900 to 8,500 feet in elevation. But ironically, here's the interesting part. You'll notice the entrance of the river right here doesn't have snow on it. The reason it doesn't have snow on it is because it's much lower in elevation. It's only 2,800 feet. So the water enters the canyon at 2,800 feet. And then apparently it went uphill to carve this canyon. In other words, if you look at it, you've got this 270-mile area where it's all allegedly running uphill. Here's a better picture of it. Colorado River enters the canyon at 2,800 feet elevation, and it runs downhill. The ground slopes up to the top of the Grand Canyon at 6,900 to 8,500 feet of elevation. Guys, that right there should show you that the whole idea that the river carved this thing over millions of years is garbage. Because why in the world would the entrance where the river comes in be so much lower in elevation than the midsection? You got 270 miles of area that is almost 3 times as high in elevation. But we're not done yet. The other thing that we got to think about is the river flow. So think about this. You got the top of the canyon that we got to consider as being so high, elevation-wise. It's higher than the bottom of the canyon. We know the river only runs through the bottom, so how in the world did it cut through a part that is so much higher than the where it enters? Number 3, the top is higher than where the river enters by over 4,000 feet. And number 4, we know that rivers don't run uphill. So how in the world did it ever even cut through those 270 miles that's over 4,000 feet higher than where it began? Bottom line is, river didn't cut that canyon. And I think a lot of folks know that. A lot of people. The other point that I put on the bottom right here, number 5, I said there is no delta, meaning a delta is basically where the river would deposit all the sediment. How many of you guys have actually seen the Grand Canyon?
I've never seen it. I think we're going to take a vacation there soon.
I am.
Okay, John's seen it. Chuck? Gary?
Yep.
One of the things that you'll notice if and when you get out there is that you can't find where all the dirt was deposited if it was cut by a river. We'll stop right there and let you guys take a break. We'll come back to it.